Louis Lutz is an emeritus professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Hilda Lloréns is a professor anthropologist at the University of Rhode Island. Dr. Frank Mitchell is the director of the Amistad Center for Art and Culture at the Wadsworth Atheneum. And I don't want to take up much time with introductions, but I thought that somebody from Trinity should actually welcome you because Frank will be kind of the moderator of this discussion. Personally, I feel that we should. I'm very interested to hear the reactions from Frank and Hilda, who are our guests here. Louis and I are the artists who will be happy to answer your questions, but I'm going to turn it over to Frank, who will basically run the proceedings and moderate the discussion.
Thanks, Pablo. You make it sound much more sort of like formal than I imagine it's going to be. And we also want to hear from folks in the room. This is imagined to be part of, I guess, a semester-long conversation about all kinds of issues that we, or certainly that I see, coming out of these photographs generally, and out of this constellation of images together. So hopefully today will be the start of that conversation, and there'll be other opportunities for people to come back in class or in groups or on their own and think about what this series of images and the intentions behind them have to say to us in 2017 at this exact moment, if I can't be any more obtuse about what you say. So one of my jobs here, I think, is to thank everybody. As Pablo said, I'm Frank Mitchell, and I have the pleasure of managing the Amistad Center for Art and Culture. We are a collection of art and artifacts based at the Wadsworth Atheneum, where we have been for 30 years. And our collection came to us through the work of Randolph Lindsay Simpson. Simpson was not a person of African descent, but early on in his life was fascinated with Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln and began collecting that material so that we now have this resource to program from. One of the opportunities is that his view of what the stories might be around African American history and culture are different from ours in the early 21st century. So we're always looking for ways in which to make sense of and encourage new ways of seeing that material that he collected from the mid-20th century to near the end of it. One of those ways is working with artists to come into the collection and see new things that we have taken for granted over the years. And so I'm grateful to Louis for coming in and helping us to see things in that collection that we hadn't seen, or see things in new ways. And that certainly was the impetus for the work that you see on the walls from Louis. So thank you for that. That's a practice that we believe is critical, having artists come in and do work with the collection, but we also feel like everybody should have that opportunity. So school children, families on the weekend, educators, folks like you in the audience, we're working hard to find ways to make it possible for anybody to come in, discover new things in the collection, find new ways of seeing that material, and create some new work based on it. And I guess I should also acknowledge the team that helped us put this together. So the artists certainly, all the sponsors, and I was going to read them, but they're in the announcement card and probably in the catalog, so look at that. Clearly Trinity was super important in making this happen, and a bunch of departments kicked in, so thank you very much. The folks at the Wadsworth, especially in the registrar's office, Mary and Paige, who helped us get the material here. Nothing actually leaves or goes anywhere without them. Our staff at Amistad, and I especially want to acknowledge Felice and her team. You were amazing to work with. And I'm going to just generally introduce some of the context behind the show and then kind of open it up. So a couple years ago, maybe more than that, more than a couple years ago, we were doing a show at the Amistad Center on Hurricane Katrina and Black creativity and New Orleans history. And Louis was in that show, and we had been trying to work together, and we finally got it together to bring some of his work that he'd been doing on New Orleans, to Hartford for that exhibition. And he wanted to come up and see the show, and he was going to be around in June. So we figured out a time when he could be here. I'd pick him up in New Haven and bring him to Hartford to see the show. The only problem with that day was that I'd already told Pablo I would come see him here on campus and have a long meeting about his Hartford Scene exhibition. And so I worried, could I bring everybody together and have it work out? I shouldn't have worried, because obviously whenever photographers get together, they're completely collaborative and really genial, and they share, and they're nice. Faculty, not so much. Now it's my concern. But we got here, we had a great time. You were amazing, you're always a good host. You were amazing, you're always a good guest. And that was sort of the genesis of this project. Louis came back a bunch of times to be in our space and look at work and begin photographing the material, and often on those trips, you guys got together, and so it was amazing when the show opened in our space and you saw, oh, there's all this synergy that we hadn't realized was there. So I'm really glad that was able to occur, and I take maybe not full credit, but a whole bunch of credit. But I also acknowledge that those kind of collaborations are only possible because of the work of folks here at Trinity who set the ball rolling a long time ago, especially through the Hartford Studies Project. And so I want to acknowledge any of the folks in the room who were part of that great effort, and certainly our time together with Susan and Jim and all those folks who made it possible to imagine the college's network in the city of Hartford and the ways it can partner with all kinds of organizations. So even though a bunch of folks are gone, that legacy remains. And with that, I want to push us into the discussion around the work. So we at the Amistad Center have increasingly been challenged, certainly this year, with thinking about how we find new ways of seeing what's in the collection. And one of the reasons I love this exhibition is it's all about seeing work in archives in new ways. And it's an acquired skill, and I'd love for you guys to talk a bit about how you have, in our team and on our side, we talk about sort of an equity lens that helps us see things in new ways, but how, if you'll permit me, you found or created an equity lens that helps you see embedded meanings in the work that the producers might not have originally seen. We run an Equity Arts Institute for educators, public school educators from around the state, and that was last week. And so we brought together a lot of folks to talk about how we help them train their eyes to see things that they probably haven't seen in their classrooms, in the administration, in their school buildings. And maybe the best example from that is talking with somebody whose kid is in a public school in New Haven. It's a good public school, not super diverse, so a few black students, and she realized that her son was in a math class, and it wasn't pre-algebra, with all the other black boys in the school in that grade, and yet none of them were actually dispersed through the other math classes. And so she wondered about that, and she asked the teachers, and they were sort of like, what do you mean? And so she said, well, my kid needs to be in pre-algebra. And then she heard from another parent who was also a school administrator, he's a principal, and he went in and said the same thing, but he said, not just my kid, all the kids. Clearly the teachers weren't seeing that in those classes there was one clump of black kids, and that was the problem. And the challenge was, how do we encourage people or give people the tools to see these kinds of problems? And we believe that looking at art, thinking about culture is a way of giving people skills to do that work. And so I think this project is amazing because in it you've been able to look at things that we take for granted and encourage us to think about finding the new meanings. So I think with that as a kind of opening framework, one of the questions I have for you is really, how does this influence the work that you do now, and what gives you the background? How have you trained yourself to go into collections and think about what's here that the curators, the administrators, everybody is seeing one way, but that I can see this way? And how do I project that out into the world? And as I discussed in the essay, there is some danger in that. Not everybody's going to see what you're seeing, and to the extent that you want to present this material as art without lots of qualification and codicil, there's a challenge for us as viewers to find your meaning or to bring our own meanings to it, and that's some of the work that we've been doing at the Institute. So that's sort of what I want to present as a backstop, and I want to actually turn this over to Hilda to add a little more commentary before you guys start talking back to us.
So this is a perfect segue because I wrote a little commentary here. So just first I'd like to thank Pablo and Frank and Louis and everyone who was part of organizing this, and it's really an honor for me to be here with the three of you, and certainly Pablo and Louis as well, who are just incredible. artists, and I have a high regard for them, obviously. I'm gushing over here, right? So I wanted just to take a few minutes to speak about two broad topics related to the consumption of images, actually. And so one, the first topic is the politics of looking and of feeling, right? The politics of looking and the politics of feeling, and how this is entangled with our biographies. And so when we look at the same photograph or photographs, do we feel the same thing, right? This is a question that goes back to someone like Virginia Woolf, who in 1938 wrote a book called Three Guineas. And that book is her reflection about the roots of war. Susan Sontag picks up the same question in her book on photography and in regarding the pain of others. And it is a question that others have asked and people continue to ask. When we look at the same photograph, when we look at the same image or set of images or photographs, do we feel the same thing? And so in terms of where I come in here, I should say that I have been looking at archival images from various vantage points throughout my life. I have looked at some of these images, actually, especially Pablo's images, from the vantage point of an Afro-descendant woman, Afro-descendant Puerto Rican woman, from the perspective of a colonial subject. And I have also looked at these images through the theoretical and conceptual lenses of visual anthropology, which is my training. So one of the reasons, and this is a shameless plug, I know, but one of the reasons that led me to the writing of my own book, Imaging the Great Puerto Rican Family, which is here, about images of Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans in the 20th century, was that I had never seen, and my family does not own, any photographs of my grandparents. And so as a modern 20th century person, right, and now 21st century person, steeped in images as we are, I had a curiosity about what my own ancestors looked like. And so I turned to archival and historical images of Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans, and they were my conduit to my grandparents' and great-grandparents' historical reality. So what I found when I looked at these images, what I found was an incredible archive of anonymous people, many of whom appear in images as nameless and locationless subjects. And they stand in for labels such as natives of Puerto Rico or Puerto Ricans, and so on and so forth. And they appear as tropical archetypes, ethnographic specimens, and curiosities. So when I read Professor Delano's statement, artist statement for the Museum of the Old Colony, which is his other conceptual exhibit, he wrote that in that exhibit is as much an exploration of history as it is an intensely personal exercise by its creator to understand and come to terms with his own relationship with the island. And I also looked at Professor Watt's description of his work, and he says that his work centers around the cultural landscape, primarily in communities occupied by people of African descent. So each of our biographies are relevant and inform the ways in which we are even able to look at, grapple with, and work through archival images and all images, really. When we look at these images, we are indeed looking back into a reality that we can only begin to apprehend through these images, and sometimes through historic texts. A question that arises, at least for me, is where are we in the history of moral feelings and in the history of sorrow in relation specifically to these images? The second conceptual idea that I like to point out is when we look at these images and these book covers and some of the advertisements, are we looking at photographs of trauma, images of trauma? Are these indeed traumatic images? So photos of war, natural disaster, lynching, hunger, and so on, in many ways have become generic in the 21st century. Unless that is the image pricks you, right, as Roland Barthes have said, when an image pricks you, that is that something in an image makes you stop in your tracks and regard the image closely, perhaps even etching itself into your long-term memory. Many of the images taken of Puerto Rican people and African Americans focus on powerless, reduced to their powerlessness. And so that what we see are nameless, powerless, brown and black-skinned people. And this is now a standard trope in the history of photography. So to photograph and to produce book covers and advertisement, et cetera, is to frame, and that framing is somebody's choosing. Somebody choose to frame what's inside. But that framing also excludes that which doesn't make it into the frame, right? So it seems to me that in Art from the Archive, which is the exhibit that we're seeing here right now, the artists are in fact framing and thereby making us have a close-up look at the images, some of which are, I think, traumatic. And I say this because that they represent colonial subjugation, racism, and exploitation. But these are also images, if you look closely enough, these are images that also, sometimes the subjects demand that we as viewers confer respect and personhood upon them. And so there is a lot for you to do in terms of being a consumer and a viewer. You also have a responsibility as to what you confer to these images and how you encounter and grapple with the images you are facing, right? And so I'll just leave it at that, and maybe we can have a conversation about some of these questions. Yeah.
Sure. All right. Jump in.
All right. So I've actually this is my fifth or sixth trip to Hartford, showing work at the Amistad, and I think 2 years ago when the building was under construction, Frank had Eric Porter and me come and talk about our book, New Orleans Suite. Where was it?
Yes. Raise your hand.
Yes, thank you. And so afterwards, I was sitting in his office, and there was a pile of books there. And I picked up the first book was like a first edition by Frederick Douglass, and I remember saying, "What is this?" I mean, it was like this thing in the hand, and it was absolutely beautiful, and obviously kind of really. Almost like I could almost feel sort of because this was a historical document. So Frank said, "Well, funny you should mention this because we are having artists to respond to the archive." And I raised my hand and said, "Absolutely, I would definitely like to do this." And a lot of times, work will evolve but when I saw the book, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I knew that I wanted to kind of decontextualize them and make large reproductions, and probably use material that related to the original source. So these are printed on canvas and also handmade paper as a way of kind of, and it was interesting to me, a lot of the 19th century books at that point, there were no video games. Books were how people got both their information and also entertainment, and the books were just absolutely beautiful as objects. So kind of the idea of the artifact, I was really interested in just seeing what would happen, I think for the same reason that Pablo and I take pictures, to sort of see what happens, whatever's happening in front of the instrument we're using to record, how that translates into a two-dimensional kind of set of impressions on flat surface. And it was not a surprise that I would be kind of respond to this work. And then the other thing that was really interesting to me was besides these, literary gems, there were slave narratives, and there was also in the collection things like the, soap powder or darky toothpaste, and it seemed perfectly natural that the sort of full range of those archives would be in an institution like the Amistad. And in terms of many of the books in their collection, the only other place they probably were was in a private white library someplace in the South where you would never get access to it. So it was both exciting and interesting and not surprising that that institution would be the repository of that wide variety of material, some of which I scanned but have not even been able to look at yet. Some of it's like really stereotypical. But the other thing that's happened with this work and that people have responded to is that there was a art book fair in an art center in San Francisco where I showed the work, and people seemed to be very excited about it, and it was great because I got a gallery affiliation, and so that was nice. And then the special collections of the library at U.C. Santa Cruz was where I taught. was very interested in it and actually has purchased a full range of those. Does the Amistad get a cut of that? I'm not sure. Okay. So on some level, this is a new departure because I'm usually a photographer photographing real time. But as I thought about it, and I think one of the things we have in common is the idea of time has always been really important in the work that I do. That I was when I first started photographing, I was really interested in the evidence of, I was in Seattle where my family had migrated from the South, and I was interested in the evidence of that migration. And actually, when I really became a photographer, I had been a history and political science major as an undergrad. I said, oh, I'm an artist, all this history and culture is behind me, but of course that's what all my work's been about. And so I was really interested in the first set of sets of photographs in photographing evidence of what people brought with them when they migrated from one place to another, and how that was shown in the landscape and how it was shown in what people did. And then going to the South and seeing the source of that and seeing what remained intact, what changed. And at some level, this is, I think, an extension of that I'm interested in kind of how the sort of information delivery systems, books and advertising, what it looked like, and what it looked like now when I kind of recontextualize it and fiddle with it a little bit. I was really interested in things like the patina on the page, 12 Years a Slave. I mean, you know, that's the time when since that book was published is in those pages, and that was really exciting and interesting to me. So that's sort of how this came to be.
So I'm going to just backtrack a little bit because I think it would be interesting for you to know some of the history of the exhibit and how it came to be. Just briefly, this exhibit was kind of jump-started and happened out of nowhere in about 6 months.
It was actually about a 5-minute conversation.
Yeah. And it started when Louis invited me to an opening reception for an exhibition that he has at the Amistad Center, and I went down there and I saw some of these things, and I thought, it blew my mind because we were independently working on such similar ideas and such similar concepts. In other words, both of us were documentary photographers. Both of us were photographers who had been committed to photographing certain aspects of the world that was our world, a world that had to do with our heritage, or a world that we related to. But both of us, for some reason, at the same point in time, had sort of drifted into these projects that were in their own way documentary, but had to do more with acquiring images and framing, as Hilda was saying, you know, making certain choices about which images we chose and how to frame them. And both of us were independently, without knowing it, although we knew each other, making these large images from these historical sources that were close to our hearts for whatever reason. The strongest reason being, I think, they were connected to who we are and our identity and where we were coming from. So this was when in May or April, and then so here we're sitting right with this exhibit, which just we both sort of immediately dove into and made happen, thanks to the people like, you know, Felice and Frank and others who have helped us realize the vision. The other thing I wanted to point out a little bit is that I think that in some ways it's a very striking exhibit for Hartford, because the both bodies of work coming together in a kind of funny way reflect the makeup of Hartford, right? Hartford has a huge Puerto Rican population, somewhere hovering around 40%, maybe a bit higher. Helder, what was that, 40? Is that what I thought 40-some%, you know? And the black population is also very, very significant here in Hartford. And so the dynamics between those communities in Hartford are interesting, as they are here. One of the things that we see, I think, for instance, in the photographs that I've chosen to work with, and this came about just because it's part of the work, not so much that I was conscious of it, although after we started working together I became more conscious of it, right, is the way that these images from Puerto Rico were racialized in a way that was informed by notions of race coming from the United States, in particular the south of the United States, right, so that even though most of the photographs that I'm working with are the images, because I expanded beyond photographs, obviously, to work with illustrations and book covers and whatnot. In a lot of them, you can see the kind of racial language and racial tropes that were just brought directly around, dumped and imposed upon Puerto Rico. In most of the images that I'm working with, they're images that were actually created to justify and explain American colonialism, to make it seem acceptable and good and charitable, not to the people on the island, but to the people in the north to whom this whole experiment was being, had to be explained. And so many of the pictures that I've worked with come out of books that were published immediately after the invasion, 1898, 1899, books that were published with the express purpose of selling the idea that colonialism and empire was a good thing, and it was a good area for the U.S. to expand into, so anyway, you see these kinds of dialogues between the works. You talked about earlier. You're talking about, I can't remember if you said today, maybe last night at dinner, about the collection of Uncle Tom's Cabin books that you've got. Well, I find in these references, in the Puerto Rican material, a lot of references to Uncle Tom and Uncle Tom's Cabin, and a U.S. military captain deeply regretting the fact that he missed the production of La Cabaña del Tío Tom in Ponce. It was because he had seen it in South Carolina and he really wanted to see it performed in Spanish, and on and on and on. So the more you look, the more you see this kind of way that these things are interwoven. And finally, I just want to touch on a word I think you used, Hilda, this idea of this being evidence, right? Almost, we've talked about this, Louis, right? In the sense of this, we're holding it up and here, look, right? And how that notion of evidence changes with time, right? Like in 1898, it was supposed to accomplish something else. Hopefully, as you have cited, Frank, that there's a level of trust that we have with the viewer, that they'll be able to, that they'll know how to interpret it. I think sometimes yes, sometimes no. I think there's a level of trust. I think there's also a risk that they won't, and it's a risk that I think we're willing to take. But yeah.
Thanks. So I think maybe the format will be, we'll take a couple of questions here, and then we'll throw it out to everybody there, and hope that you guys have got some questions or ways of seeing that'll be new to us that you'll want to share. Just want to note the reference to evidence and evidence of migration, and that work just got somebody in MacArthur out of Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Jason,
yeah.
an anthropology.
Keep thinking about that, people. I'm intrigued by the issue of moral feelings and sorrow and the sense of trauma. There's an interesting tension in the work as it's composed in this space, that some of it is really, I don't want to say proud, but there are images that could elicit pride, and there are images that really are sad or slightly traumatic. And I'm interested in the pairings and why you guys chose this sort of balance between things that clearly are sentimental and make you happy and make you feel good, with things that clearly are troubling and problematic, and why you couldn't stay away from the troubling, problematic, and why you think it lives reasonably or nicely with the work that is clearly about celebration of pride.
No, and I want to add to that also that sometimes it's the same image.
Mm-hmm.
That pride, that you're repulsed and by an image, but also that you find beauty in it, right? So the contradictions are so strong that they're even within the same image. The lower of the two stereographs in back, Sunday Best. This is clearly was done as a mockery of children in Puerto Rico who didn't have proper clothes and they're dressed in rags. And yet, whoever wrote this caption thought it would be funny, right? To mock the way they're dressed, and it's not only is it mocking, I think it's called Puerto Rican, right? The colonial spelling, Puerto Rican boys in their Sunday dress, right? Near Ay Bonita, right? They've got the towns. The name of the town is Ay Bonito, right? And it's a town that's currently devastated, by the way, and I don't want to, at some point I'd like to touch on the fact of how these images really can, you know, you can connect them to what's happening now on the island and the response to the hurricane. That's another whole tangent we can maybe go on later, but yeah. I mean, but I think you see those kinds of contradictions a lot.
So where's the celebration in that? What are you seeing in the celebration?
That the boys are, they're beautiful boys. They're just beautiful boys. They're looking into the camera. They have no shame, and so there's you know, there's this dignified look or glance, you know, despite every attempt to humiliate and make fun and mock.
And Lois, is there an image where you feel that tension is captured, or can you talk a bit about why pair Darky toothpaste with Crisis Magazine,
Right.
or we've got him here next to John Brown, but sort of the need to have both of those moments represented in the work?
Well, all of these were actually, the camera I used was a scanner, so which was interesting, and it really is working as a, so there were the sort of, I mean, it all were things in space, three-dimensional, but, you know, the books were relatively flat. It was interesting doing these, but I think I was attracted to both these images because of that sort of thing, the duality, because they really are beautiful. The kind of graphics are interesting, and there's a number of other ones that you've been spared. And the sort of conclusion I came to was like how hard somebody was working to sort of, and this is, you know, increase and develop the myth of white supremacy. And it was really for white working class people that these incredible stereotypes or kind of ways that you could dehumanize was a great way to get people who were really catching almost, if not as much hell economically, that they would sort of buy the myth that at least they were better than this group that other people were dehumanizing. And so and again, as I repeated, not interesting, but I think that it was important and not surprising that archive would exist alongside of you know, sort of heroes and really important artists, sort of on the same you know, bookshelves, or along with other artifacts. So I guess I, on some level, was making aesthetic choices, but the idea of what was appealing to me visually was obviously informed by a lot of other things that I've been thinking about and was really interested in. If that makes sense. I was going to say, the other thing is now, I've shown this work, and someone just gave me a copy in German of Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was like Onkel Tom's Städel or something, which is really, and a drawing that obviously was probably done in Germany, because that sort of depiction of people with dark skin was very strange, with strange features. And someone asked, I guess there's in Berlin, there's a bus stop named Uncle Tom's Cabin in Germany. And someone says, what is their interest in that? And I think it's parallel to the Germans are really interested in Native Americans, North America, that they really, I was sort of thinking maybe because they can sort of hold them at arm's length and exotify them. But they really celebrate and reproduce. So it's that idea of how both imagery gets transformed by other cultures and kind of what people do with it, I think is also related to this, because I think before the internet, books were how that kind of information, you know, both visually and literally, got from one place to the other.
No, I would like to hear
Yeah.
what people in the audience are thinking as they hear this.
There's a hand. Dario, I think goes first.
Yeah, whatever besides your artistic sensibilities, that English is the primary language of the exhibit. In other words, what's presented, the books and so forth. Is it because there are no Spanish, for example? Because material or is it a choice, or why is that? That's what I'm trying to get at, because it just strikes me as not that it should, but because Spanish is my first language. Amistad, after all, is a Spanish word, and that was captured in Cuba and so forth, and got to Connecticut, and I'm curious about that.
Well, in my work, it's part of this idea of framing and deliberate choice. I think you've read the essay that Nelson Rivera wrote in reaction to the exhibition that I had in New York, which was called The Museum of the Old Colony. And he points out something that I'm very grateful to him actually for pointing this out, which is that one of the things that he finds compelling about this work is that unlike a lot of Puerto Rican art, which pays tribute to our wonderful cultural traditions, whether musical or visual or the landscape, this turns the eye on the colonizer and lets us look at the colonizer the way the colonizer looks at us, right? So this is specifically, the materials that I chose to work with are specifically the vision of the colonizer, but hopefully geared towards us so that we can see how we were seen. And I would hope that then that would provoke thought among us about our relationship with the colonizer. So, of course, the material that they produced was in English because it wasn't geared to the people on the island. I should add that one of the first things that the colonizer did was impose the English language as the language of education in the schools. It didn't catch on, right? And it was a long, long, long battle. I mean, decades and decades. It wasn't until the 50s, right, that finally they gave up and said, okay, we can't, this is just not working. But the reason that the texts are in English is because the images were made for consumption in North America.
Can I add to that also? I like to say that in regards to this question, you know, this is in the way that I look at the images in my own work, some of the same images. I frame this in the entire work as images that come out of the American century. And so this is a specific American vision of the Caribbean and of itself that I think that we're engaging with. And I think, you know, that's a really good point, but that's the reply, that this is a specific vision that the American century has brought to us, right? From that moment in 1898 and consequently. And one of the other things about the images of the traditional images of Puerto Rico, which is something that a lot of people often miss, is that many of these traditional images were actually captured by photographers first, right? And this is one of the things I talk about in my book, is that, you know, for your father, for instance, I have to bring up, sorry. He, you know, he was there early on, and so was Roscom and other important American photographers. And they, because the camera was a lot more portable, they went into places that painters couldn't go into, right? So a lot of the pictures that we see now as traditional images from Puerto Rico, a lot of the paintings specifically, comes out as a direct reflection of what the American photographers photographed. And some of those images, and this is a whole vein which I haven't seen many other people think about, of what we call traditional Puerto Rican photos, are actually photos of workers and laborers. And so we, you know, what we're dealing with in terms of the vision of the American century is both, you know, racializing, right, the racialization of people in specific ways for American consumption. So we see these bodies as disposable, right, on the one hand, right? So they're both beautiful, you know, aesthetically pleasing, you know, all kinds of, right, all the kinds of narratives we place on bodies, but also disposable and or workers, laborers that then can, you know, labor on the behalf of the American banks, right? And so I think it's important to sort of think about that, you know, about the American visions that we're sort of grappling with here. So.
I think it's more than theoretical. It's actually referenced in the text. I mean, people are often referred to as types, you know, worker type or dark type or this type or that type.
Yeah, and just as a coda, at a more primal level, the two most significant ways of operating, certainly for advertising in the early 20th century and the late 19th century, would have been around nostalgia and sentimentality and humor. So to the extent that so many of these images fit into a category that's either about reinforcing people's notions of the Old South or of Puerto Rico in some colonialist sense, or people found them funny in ways that we wouldn't today, were the ways that you could sell stuff that they didn't have irony or postmodern sensibilities, and so that's how things worked. Yes?
I'm not a photographer, I'm a viewer, but a fairly naive viewer. So I'd be curious to hear more about your sense of the responsibility of the viewer.
The viewer.
Yes.
I was worried about the photographer. Well, I think it's interesting that there'll be people that will come into this room when there's nobody here, maybe not having a lot of information about it, and they will respond probably in a different way than most of the people here, especially after what you've heard so far. And I think those are both obviously valid. I mean, they're realities. I guess I'm really a big person for like instinct, and so I think your instincts are informed by experience and everything. But I think you have to just look. And if you're really looking, that will generate both ideas, hopefully will generate questions, and other kinds of maybe less logical responses, like visceral responses. I mean, I think that's one of the functions, sometimes is the curse of visual information, So I'm not sure if I think I have some ideas about it, but I think that everybody has to bring their own kind of knowledge and baggage to whatever they're encountering. And I know that the college students in this room and the people I've taught have an incredible amount of visual sophistication, because that's how they get information. I mean, you know that sort of people are they're more visually literate than the other kinds of literacy, for sure. I mean, in ways that really always astonish me. And there's a reason why, even people that aren't interested in maybe being photographers, everybody's interested in getting their hands on the media. I mean, that's why I think people make pictures with iPhones more than they talk on them. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of my response.
And I'll just quickly add to that. In laying this out, and again, a big nod to Felice, in thinking about these pairings, but also thinking about how much people could tolerate it and what would happen when folks came here when we weren't doing this kind of a presentation. I understand there will be other conversations on campus this semester that might give people the tools for unpacking some of this work. But we've tried to kind of excerpt some text that'll give people a little bit of guidance if you were to come in and have nobody here. And I think, as Lewis says, looking really closely, being patient and taking time with the images and trying to find the balance between things that seem lyrical and beautiful and like a celebration, and those things that are somewhat challenging or scary. And hopefully there isn't too much scary to balance out some of the celebration, and then thinking about that. And I think that's, certainly as somebody who puts images on the wall for a living, my hope is always that folks are going to come into the gallery and spend the time to do that hard work, and to put some things in there that really will make them step back and think about what they know, along with some things that they can feel good about. And when I go to a gallery, I'm always thinking, please God, let there be one thing that's just beautiful and I don't have to sort of wrestle with. And usually you get that reward. And so I hope people come to the space looking for a celebration, but also looking to be challenged.
I would be interested in both the people's responses and the questions you have about the work. I mean, I think.
But I just want to add one thing to the question in terms of the responsibility of the viewer. I would hope, and this is just hope, that a viewer would feel that they needed to have some sense of responsibility, specifically when approaching these images. I mean, I think that there's a one thing we haven't talked much about, right, is the relationship between the texts and the images. I struggle with what to do with the text, because sometimes the texts themselves are more compelling than the picture. And sometimes I'll have a text that is incredibly compelling. The picture visually maybe doesn't stand up quite as much. I try to avoid that, right? I try to use examples where the image and the text are both very, very powerful and compelling. But sometimes I've had people question the texts and actually accuse me of writing them, or making them up, in a very shy, so you wrote that? That's supposed to be satiric? And that led me to feel that as much as possible, I'd like to scan and include the actual texts. So the two pictures in the back the one of the healthiest boy and the one of the school for maids, I've actually included the scan of the original text to try to clarify that, to make, you know, the responsibility of the viewer somewhat easier. I don't know. Still, people ask, but.
Felice?
I think a little more on the viewer thing, the scale of the pieces and the sheer beauty of the pieces forces us to enter the images in a way that we may not have done with the original object. And I spent a lot of time in here, and you know, sometimes I have to avert my eyes a bit because I want to go up and I want to look at the toothpaste really closely, and I also don't want to. But you can feel the object, you can see it, the beauty in the red. There's the scale really forces us to pay attention in a different way. So I think it's a big part of both of the work. I mean, things don't exist like this. It's beyond the photograph. They become an object because they are objects. There are objects also. So just another thing.
Yeah, I really like the fact that there are things of such different political valence, almost unmarked, side by side. And I wanted to make a comment about that. There's a line that I've been thinking about a lot, which is that, you know, the colonizer doesn't allow the colonized to be pure. In other words, this is what culture is. Culture is both these very disturbing images which are in everyday artifacts, but it's also on a Langston Hughes book cover. But culture doesn't, and I think what happens with a lot of curated shows is that because there's often a strong point being made or driven, the complexity of culture gets evacuated. And what I like about this, and I'm going to think about it a lot now, is that because it's so stark, the contradiction, it should help people think about how culture is so stark and also cruel, because culture is not always a positive resource. It can be so very cruel. So I think it's, you know, I just want to congratulate you for putting these things together.
There's a hand way in the back.
Yeah, I'm just curious about something. The title is Art for Archives, correct? Which is working on the assumption that you've gone into archival material. Lois, is that the way it works? And you select work that would deal in the past? 90%, I assume that that's what this is. So that's why I'm struck by this concept, like the darky toothpaste. I was just in Singapore maybe 5 years ago. And I swear to God, I went to a pharmacy, and there was about 500 of these in the windows displayed. This is not in the past. I just saw this thing, and I was in Germany before the war came down. I mean Berlin, and had a show there. And I remember I was amazed at these things existed, especially the book you're talking about, Sandbar. That was prevalent in the public school system then. And that's they were living in like the 1800s. But I'm curious, when you say we go to the archival stuff, when you go to museums and galleries, you're going into their archival stuff or you bringing stuff? I'm trying to get that in my mind because I know a lot of stuff, mostly by third world artists created, were in the archive. Were never in the museum or the gallery, etc. So I find that fascinating because I myself personally have gone into some museum archival and where did this art come? Where did you get this Romeo beard? You know, that kind of stuff. And I'm always fascinated by that.
Well, this work, at least the work, but my work came from the Amistad around the corner.
This is
yeah,
from Amistad,
yeah,
not here. Oh,
no.
I was just curious.
Yeah, no, that one. Although it's interesting that now I'm going to go to the Schomburg. You know, it's kind of like, I guess my practice has expanded, so I am really interested. And I still say on the top of the list of things, the aesthetics, the sort of what they look like, obviously in their historical I mean, that really is a thing that I'm really interested in. You know, and obviously that's not at the expense of something else. And like I said, I define aesthetics pretty broadly. But I have to be, something about the artifact has to attract me in some way or repulse me or like have a response. And then I can like capture it. It's interesting. Now, photography is now called, like one of the terms for making an image is capturing, which is, you know, or you take a picture. So it's interesting that something, it goes both ways, but I think it goes mostly this way. It's just sort of grabbing something when you try to grab a picture.
In my case, the archive was a personal collection that came about over 20, 30 years of just finding images. But the reason that I was able to assemble this archive in part was because the original drive to create these images in 1898, 1899, and in the year of the invasion and the years shortly thereafter, there was an enormous effort to publicize the colonial experiment in the mainland. So books were printed and published in huge quantities, and many, many, many books, right? So that even though today they're over 100 years old, they're still very, very cheap because there's so many out there. And I like to think I have every single one. But you can get them for $10, $15, and the images. I mean, I think the most so-called valuable one is called Our Islands and Their People. It's a 2-volume thing, and these huge, heavy books, right? But even those books now are very, very inexpensive. So I was able to assemble that over 20, 30 years, never knowing what I was going to do with it, and it wasn't until the last 5 years or so that I was able to conceptualize how to create new work, out of this just collection of images that I had been amassing because I found them so compelling. I guess I should add that I have this is a project apart from this that feeds into this, in which the archive is an imaginary archive, and it's an imaginary museum called the Museum of the Old Colony. And some of you, maybe somebody will know what Old Colony is. Old Colony was actually a grape and pineapple soda. It's actually still made, right? Still made. It's a brand that was brought from the U.S. to Puerto Rico by the military to be sold in the PXs and whatnot. It caught on. It's really sweet. It's artificially flavored, and the brand went bankrupt in the U.S., but it is still made in the island and marketed there by the local brewery, Medalla in Mayagüez. We don't know what they're producing now, but anyway, yeah.
So you guys have been amazing. I thank you for your attention and your patience. I think there's one more hand if you will take that.
So I just have a question for Pablo specifically, because I did see the exhibit in New York, and I am Puerto Rican, and so coming from a family that's, I feel like, maybe never taught us about the colonialism and all of the effects as it was coming into the island. And so I'm wondering if you've had any pushback from within the culture about being, well, I don't know what your political stance is, but if your views are anti-colonialism and Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, and if you've been accused of being a machismo, or is the work mostly just to educate people? I know you can't really take the politics out of the work, but what is your stance on work in general?
Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge that not only you saw the show in New York, but you were an enormous help to me putting it up, and I really appreciate that. But to your question, I keep going back to the term evidence, and I like to think that I'm throwing these up as evidence for people to look at and almost say, see, you see, look. So yes, I mean, I think that there's an educational thing behind it, like that I would like for people to actually see where they come from, where we come from, what was imposed upon us. But there's also an aesthetic. Decision making. I mean, some of these pictures are beautiful, right? And then you look at them and maybe you read the text that goes with them, and then you're repulsed. And maybe you're repulsed at the fact that you found them beautiful, but that doesn't make them not beautiful. So those kinds of visceral interaction, those kinds of visceral reactions, I think, are important, and I hope will really force people to think harder about what it really means.
So these guys haven't eaten yet, so we'll be here for a while. If you have any questions, come up, say hi, talk to us. Thank you. Thank you very
Thanks for
much.
coming.